Hey guys, today we are in Luke chapter 6. Now, Luke chapter 6, as you read this, especially as we have read Matthew and Mark, you're going to see a lot of things that we've read and they seem jumbled or compressed together. And the best way to understand this is Jesus would not have just taught, for example, the Sermon on the Mount one time at that one place. This is something that he would have spoke many, many times again. A lot of the parables, it would have been where he spoke many, many times. And so Luke here being this is putting in some of these key teachings that we've read in Matthew and Mark, and he's compressing them together for one, for the sake of getting them in his gospel. But for two are things that he would have heard probably over and over and over again as Jesus moved from Galilee to Perea, to Jerusalem, back to Perea, back to Galilee, over to the Gentile countries, back to Galilee. So as he was going, he would have been teaching a lot of the same things, in hopes that the crowds that were following would hear it over and over and they would get it and they would understand. Or the parables, they would get it and they would keep thinking about it and thinking. And Jesus starts talking about it. It would bring to the recollection that they've heard this before, right? And they would keep thinking about this and eventually wanting to know and to ask Jesus or the disciples what the meaning was, to draw them in. That was the point of it, right? So as you're reading this, a lot of it may sound familiar as we read Matthew and Mark, but maybe in different ways. And so I just wanted you to know that. But we start out with the story of Jesus being the God of Sabbath, right? And it talks about with them walking through a grain field on a Sabbath, on Sabbat, which is the holy day, right? It's the seventh day of creation, the day of rest. And that's why Jews say they can't create something on that day. And so they're walking through and the disciples are picking up some grain heads, rubbing together, getting the seeds, popping it in. It'd be very equivalent today, like eating sunflower seeds, something like that, right? So the Pharisees see this, they question them, they accuse them of breaking Sabbat, breaking one of the 10 commandments, right? And Jesus says they're not breaking the Sabbath. And he even brings up an Old Testament example of 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David breaks into the temple and gives him and his army the 12 loaves of the bread of presence. And those were dedicated to God, but they still ate them, and God didn't punish them for that, because it's not about the bread. It's not about the seeds. It's about the heart, right? And so he brings this. And then in verse 5, it says that the Son of Man, which he's calling himself, right? The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And what he's saying here, it's a direct quote of saying that he is God. He is the God of the Sabbath. Jesus is the God who created the seventh day, the day of rest, right? And so this is him unequivocally saying, I am God, right? And then we see, and what's interesting in Luke, they're back to back, right? And so we see the constant ministry of Jesus, right? So we're on one Sabbath, and now we're on another Sabbath, starting in verse 6, where on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue, and there was a man with a withered hand, right? He was going to heal him. Jesus knew the thoughts. It says he knew the thoughts of the Pharisees, but Jesus healed them anyways. And notice what they were. They weren't excited that this man was healed. They weren't excited that this man could actually get a job, that this man could be ceremonial cleansed, that he could go to the market, that he could provide for a family, that maybe he would get married if he's not married, right? They weren't happy of all those things. It says that they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do with Jesus. Once again, this tells us their heart, right? This tells us the heart of who they are. We just talked about a couple nights ago in our First John study, right? Those who say that they are a Christian but hates their brother, they are not of the light. They are not of God. This is what we're talking about right here. They didn't care about the brother. They didn't care about the man's life who got changed. They only cared about some religious rule, right? That's not biblical. We see the calling of the 12 apostles, from disciples to apostles. Remember that word apostle, apostole, means ambassador, right? People who's going to ride out before the king, but has the power of the king, has the recognition of the king to say, these are my people. So he makes the 12 apostles, which we talked about a couple Sundays ago. And then it says that Jesus ministers to great multitudes, which is interesting. Notice verse 17, it says he came down and stood with them on a level place, on a plain, right? That's what it's talking about. And a great cloud of his disciples and great multitudes of people came from Judea, from Jerusalem, from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. These are Jews and Gentiles meeting in one place. Now, when we read this, we just read it. This didn't happen often. Jews did not associate with Gentiles, but here at the feet of Jesus, they weren't friends. Don't get it messed up. They weren't friends, but they were all meeting and they were all interested. Now, there was probably some segregation there, that wouldn't allow, the Gentiles to get close with the Jews, but they were all coming to see Jesus, right? And it says that Jesus healed them all. Right? Remember, Jesus said, I came to Israel first, but Jesus healed them all, Jews and Gentiles. And then we get the Beatitudes, right? Which, remember, is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is that whole sermon. But here we just get kind of the beginning, the Beatitudes. And we don't even get all of them that we get in Matthew, right? So just think, it's not that Luke is leaving them out. He's just writing, he's just filling in some amazing things. Remember, he's writing to Gentiles, right? So some of the things he leaves out is more for the Jews, right? More toward the Jewish audience that we see in Matthew. But here he's writing to the Gentiles. What's the takeaway of that Sermon on the Mount for the Gentiles? Blessed are you who are poor in spirit, right? Somebody who is seeking after God. Blessed are you who are hungry, not just hungry because they need a snack, hungry for God. They're looking for that. Blessed are you who weep. Who weeps? People who are low, people who need, people who have a need, right? That's the Gentile nation. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. This is an amazing statement because the Jewish nation, especially the religious elite of the Jewish nation, they hated the Gentiles. Even if they were saved, even if they came to know God, they hated them. The Gentiles were far more persecuted than the Jews, right? Even if a Jew became saved, became a Christian, right? They would be persecuted by their Jewish brothers, but they would nowhere near be persecuted what a Gentile would be persecuted, just because of the hatred of the persecuted. And here is this Jesus saying, man, if you are persecuted on my name, then your reward is great in heaven. Right. And so it's just an amazing kind of step up where Jesus is not just elevating women at times, not only elevating the normal people of Israel, the non-elite he's elevating us, but now he's even elevating Gentiles, which is just an amazing thing that we do not see at that time. Then we see Jesus pronounces some woes, and basically it's the opposite, right? He just gave us the Beatitudes, and remember that word woe means a curse or a condemnation. He says, woe for you who are rich. It doesn't mean that you have money. There's plenty of rich people who love Jesus. But woe to you who are rich, which means they're not in need. If they're rich, they don't have a need. If you don't have a need, you won't need Jesus, right? You just think you can buy Jesus. Woe to you who are full now. Not just saying, oh, they're not hungry. It means that they don't have a need, that they're not hungry. They're not thirsty for a God. No thanks. I don't want that, right? A rejection of Jesus. Woe to you who laugh now. People who laugh are people who have everything, who are in good spirits, who doesn't need anything else. They're not needy, as we saw in the Beatitudes. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, right? If people always speak well of you, it's because you're not living out Christ, right? Jesus tells us the world will hate you because they hated me first. At some point, as a Christian, we will be persecuted. All Christians will be persecuted. Now, doesn't mean that you might be beaten and whipped and crucified, but there will be some. So if the world cannot tell a difference between you and a Christian, there's a problem. If they can't see Christ in you, there's a problem, right? So that's what it's talking about. And then he goes through this big kind of part of chapter 6 of thinking that we should love our enemies. Now, this is pretty new. The Old Testament talks about loving our neighbors. It does not talk about loving our enemies. And so here, Jesus kind of elevates it and says, you need to love your enemies. You need to, you're going to have to suffer, right? Your enemies are going to be mad. They're going to strike your cheek, turn the other cheek. And then we even get that golden rule, verse 31, and it says, and as you wish that others would do to you, right? So not only just love your neighbors, but now you got to love your enemies. Jesus is elevating what the Old Testament has done, right? What we talked about yesterday, new wine in new wineskins. He's not just patching the old, he's elevating it. He's bringing something new. Verse 35, but love your enemies and do good and lend, expect nothing in return. Be merciful. Once again, elevating, right? Not just love your neighbors, not just be good to your neighbors, but now we're going a step above that, right? And then starting in verse 37, we talk about judging others. And just notice what it says in verse 37 and 38. Once again, we're talking about the enemies, right? Judge not, condemn not, forgive, give, right? These words, these are words that we would say, man, this is what we would do with family, right? I don't judge my family. I don't condemn my family. I will forgive my family. I will give to my family, right? And now Jesus is saying, not only do you do that with your family, but now you do it with your friends. Now you do it even with your enemies, right? And this is just that point, right? How much are you willing to show love so that you can get across that gospel message? And then we end with verse 43, once again, talking about a tree and its fruit, right? A tree is proven by the fruit it bears, right? It says that what does it say? A fig tree are not gathered from thorn bushes, right? Are you an apple tree? Are you a pear tree? Are you an orange tree? Well, that only bears by your fruit. So if you say you're a Christian, right? If you say you're a Christ follower, is the fruit that you're bearing Christ following fruit? Or is it fruit of Satan, fruit of the world, fruit of what you want to do, right? The fruit has to match the tree. So as Jesus is talking to these Jews, to these Gentiles, as he's going out and doing these miracles, he's elevating his message of what the Israel knows as the Old Testament, but for the Gentile, right? Luke is writing to the Gentile nation. He's elevating them, saying that he loves them, he cares for them, but even at that, they have to go above and beyond. That's what Jesus did. Jesus is going above and beyond, and so Jesus wants his followers to go above and beyond, right? Jesus died for all, they should love all. Jesus died for all, they should care for all. Jesus died for all, they should forgive all. Jesus died for all, they should show mercy for all. I mean, over and over again, we see this. And then we kind of get this kind of tree, right? The fruit proves the tree. And then we get this little kind of familiar parable about the guys that build their houses, right? And he's going to go build a house. And what happens? He digs deep and he lays the foundation on a rock, right? And the storms come and the house stands. But then there's another guy who comes and he doesn't build a foundation, or he builds his house on the sand, right? And what happens? The storms come and his house collapses. And so Jesus is saying here through all of this, right? Where's your foundation? Is your foundation on this world? Is your foundation on what you think is good? Or is your foundation on what is true and what is solid, right? What is true? What is solid? God is true. God is solid. Which takes us all the way back to the very first story of chapter 6, is that healing, right? Is the Sabbath. And he said, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am God from the very beginning of creation. Will you build your foundation on me, the God who created everything, who is with everything? Or are you going to build your foundation on whatever you think is good, right? what do you want to do? I know chapter 6 was a long chapter. There's a lot of things kind of cram-packed in there, but I hope that makes sense. And I cannot wait to see you tomorrow on Luke chapter 7. God bless.